Hi, everybody. Just a quick note before the podcast begins. I figured it would be relevant information to note that this conversation with Shalon van Tine was recorded in January of 2022, so about 4.5 months or so before you're actually listening to it now. I make that note only to make very clear that that is the reason why we spend 2 hours talking about Russian films and don't ever bring up the war in Ukraine. Obviously, had we recorded this podcast at any time since late February, that would have been front and center in some of the discussion. But I just thought it would be worth noting the timing of all of this. So please do keep that in mind and enjoy my conversation with Shalon van Tine here on CounterPunch Radio. Welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in and coming back to the show. First time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Hope you've had a chance to check out CounterPunch Plus. That is our subscriber section. We launched that a while back and it's been such a success, and so grateful to those of you who have already signed up for that. As I've mentioned for the last several episodes, everything got monetized on the internet. God, I don't know how it happened, but it happened. Right now, you're paying out for all of the best content that you get, right? You want 12 different people on Substack, you got to pay for 12 different fees at 12 different rates and however all that works, right? But CounterPunch is still there. We've been there for almost 30 years. We'll continue to be there and provide something unique on the left. And that is something that you can support with a CounterPunch Plus subscription. We have all kinds of content. It's not just political analysis, although it's that. It's not just foreign affairs, although it's that too. It's cultural criticisms, essays, discourse from internal squabbles on the left in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere around the world. We have articles from people writing in India, people from East Asia, people from Latin America, and on and on. CounterPunch really covers a wide range of topics with a wide range of voices from a wide range of perspectives. And I really think that's important and valuable. And if you agree with me, CounterPunch Plus subscriptions are the way to show your support. Get one for yourself, get one for a friend, get one for your enemy, whatever it is. All right. We do appreciate that, but we do have work to do here. So this week, I have Shalon van Tine with me again. Shalon's been on the show before. We're going to talk movies. And, the last time that Shalon was on CounterPunch Radio with me, it was a three-way conversation all about movies that leftists absolutely must see. And it was Shalon and I chatting with our dearly departed friend, Louis Project. Lou passed away last year after a bout with an illness. And of course, Louis remains in our thoughts here at CounterPunch. And certainly I know that I speak for Shalon when I say that the loss of Louis was a big, big loss for all of us. And so I guess in some senses, the conversation here this evening is dedicated to Lou. So on that somewhat sour note, Shalon, welcome back to CounterPunch.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on and for all of your great work. I guess I breezed over it. Maybe I should introduce Shalon for those of you who don't know her. Shalon is an author and a researcher. She's a cultural historian specializing in American and world history. She writes at a variety of places. On her website, you can find all of her work, but also in CounterPunch. Get yourself a CounterPunch Plus subscription. You can read some of Shalon's work. You can also go to her website, shalonvantine.com. That's SHALONVANTINE, shalonvantine.com. Shalon, welcome back.
Thanks.
So, like I said, last time we chatted was with our pal Lou. Lou is, of course, no longer with us, but I know that he would just be absolutely ecstatic to talk about what we're going to talk about here this evening, which is, well, our favorite, all-time favorite Russian/Soviet films. And Lou had such an appreciation for Russian cinema, for Soviet cinema. Not only that, of course, the politics, but I know, Shalon, you are a student of the Russian Revolution, of Russian history, of Russian film. So before we begin and before we start, and not exactly doing a ranking, but running down our list of top 5 Russian language films, why don't you make us into your students and give us a quick little intro course to Russian cinema history, and why it's important.
All right, definitely. Well, last time when we talked about our favorite German films, I gave a book recommendation. So I figured I'd do that this time as well. So if any of your listeners are looking for sort of a comprehensive book that talks about Soviet cinema, I'd recommend the book Kino, A History of the Russian and Soviet Film by Jay Leida. So there's a book recommendation for your listeners on the topic. But just to give a brief overview of Russian film before we talk about them in more detail, uh, Russian cinema was very important for two different reasons. One, for the history of cinema in general, and then also politically, because Russian cinema was purely owned and controlled by the state. For Lenin, he said, of all the arts, for us, cinema is the most important. So he nationalized the film industry in 1919. So most of Soviet cinema throughout the Soviet period is going to be highly political. So there's that, but there's also the cinematic element, which is that Soviet cinema contributed to how we make films just generally. Early cinema, for those of your listeners who haven't watched a lot of old silent films, some of the most earliest silent films were just a camera just sort of staring at a scene. They didn't have much editing, much cutting, and much scene development. Um, Fast forward to the early 20th century, you have the development of montage, and montage is not what we typically think of montage today, where we think of people need to do a bunch of stuff and there's like a cheesy song playing and a bunch of stuff gets done on screen. Really, Soviet montage is about editing, and one of the key figures in the development of Soviet montage was someone who we'll talk about here today, which is Sergei Eisenstein. Now, Eisenstein actually saw Soviet montage as a Marxist dialectical process. He envisioned that film would convey very core Marxist ideas. And you can, if you're interested in looking at some of his theories, you can read his books, Film Form and Film Sense, those are a collection of his writings that talk about his theory behind cinema. So from a cinematic perspective, Russian film contributed to the way that we edit films now, in a way that's, we take for granted now, because these things have just become sort of commonplace. But before we talk about the films, I'll just briefly mention how Soviet cinema, or I should say Russian cinema more generally, went through a few different periods. And you can see recurring themes throughout these different periods, and these moments in time really reflected what uh, what the Soviet state wanted to do in terms of the Communist Party, like what the goals were for the Communist Party. That was reflected in the films. So some of the earliest Soviet films from about the from the revolution through the end of the 20s, you see a lot of the common themes of trying to solidify the Bolsheviks' version of history and justify their leadership. You see this especially in, for example, Podolkin's The End of St. Petersburg, or Alexandrov's and Eisenstein's movie October, where figures like Lenin are portrayed as sort of godlike, and Stalin is portrayed as a natural successor, and Trotsky as an enemy. You also see this theme of promoting international revolution and calling on workers everywhere to unite against their oppressors. So this idea comes up in a lot of the early silent Soviet cinema, especially in Battleship Potemkin, which I think we're going to talk about today. And another subject that comes up a lot in this in early Russian film is the power of people working together. This idea of collective action. You'll see in a lot of early Soviet films that the protagonist is not an individual. The protagonist is actually the people as a whole. That will change as Soviet cinema moves on and you get into the Stalin years. You see the change from a protagonist as the people to this very individualized, strong leader kind of figure. But early Soviet cinema didn't have that as much. But then you'll also see a theme of promoting the policy of collectivization. So themes that really sort of idealize industrialization. One of the great examples of this can be seen in a movie that we're not going to discuss today, but the movie The General Line, also called The Old and the New, where it has a churning machine given to the peasants, and there's a woman sort of almost on her knees, happy at the fact that this machine is making her life easier. And it's almost as if she's worshiping this machine and what industrialization can do for them. So you start to see these themes throughout Soviet cinema. And then as you get into the Stalin years, you see sort of a shift in theme where the movies start to focus more on a strong leader character rather than a more collective kind of idea. And then after Stalin, during the thaw, you start to see more of an incorporation of more psychological and personal themes rather than these kind of collective and political themes. So that's kind of a quick overview of Russian cinema. So I think we should just actually talk about the movies and how they portray these themes throughout.
I agree. And of course, since you've mentioned it, we might as well begin with my first film. You've already discussed it a bit, Battleship Potemkin, 1925, Sergei Eisenstein. I would just note, not that I'm tooting my own horn here, but because I am a Russian speaker, these films are particularly fun for me because I can also understand, obviously not the silent films, but those that have dialogue, I can follow along with these things. There is something that does get lost in subtitles. So unlike Chinese films or German films or whatever, I feel like I have a little bit of a window into some of the meaning and subtext of some of these films. So I'll just say that. But um, Battleship Potemkin, I mean, first of all, the movie is iconic to the extent that any movie can be iconic. I mean, some of the most famous shots and scenes of this film have been parodied so many times and referenced in so many other movies that I think a lot of people may not even realize that where they came from originally, right? So famously, the Odessa stairs scene in Battleship Potemkin with the baby carriage going down the stairs, which is referenced in a number of movies. I could think of two, one being The Untouchables, one being Naked Gun 3, both of which reference that scene. And of course, there's there's a political significance to this, and I'm gonna not just hog the mic here. I want to let you talk about that as well. But the political, you already mentioned the class conscious filmmaking. I think that Potemkin, maybe more than any other film, well, I don't want to say more than, but as much as any other film, Potemkin demonstrates this. I mean, you don't have really an individual protagonist. I mean, you do have, one or two characters that are more foregrounded than others, but there is no real protagonist. There is no real character development, no character arc of any kind. Really, it is the mass, right? And there's actually several masses, right? On throughout much of the film, there is the mass of the sailors, right? And this is shown, and I'm sure you probably would talk about this as well, but this is shown in several ways. Most obviously by the elevated camera looking down, right? The camera is at the very, up in the sky, essentially, looking down at many different individuals, all collectively organized and moving in action, right? This is the sort of cinematic manifestation of revolution in a sense, right? So you don't really see these individuals, you don't really see them as characters so much as representing masses of people in Odessa. Famously, when the ship comes into the harbor and there's famous scene, and you just see masses of people in movement, the sort of dynamism of the Soviet avant-garde. Like I said, no real personal drama, no love story, no nothing really to speak of in that way. I mean, I want to get into some of the technical aspects of this, but is there anything that you want to add to any of that, Shalon?
Yeah, I would just say that, a good way to think about it is almost as if Eisenstein's working with Marxist archetypes, almost like a medieval morality play where the characters represent more of an idea rather than, individual character types.
Absolutely, and it's deeply political. I said that I wasn't going to prep too much for this because I didn't really want to, and I didn't have the time. But um, I did prep a little bit, and I just wanted, because I remembered this being one of those films that very, very famous people had been quoted as speaking about, because Battleship Potemkin was an international sensation, maybe the first truly international sensation among the films of this period. Probably not the first, but one of the early international sensations. And when I say international, I mean truly international. It was seen by everybody across Europe, in the United States, the heads of MGM, the heads of the Nazi filmmaking industry. Goebbels himself is quoted as saying about Battleship Potemkin, quote, "This is a marvelous film without equal in cinema. Anyone who had no firm political conviction could become a Bolshevik after seeing the film." That, I think, speaks to some of the power of the film, because I think Goebbels is no slouch in understanding propaganda and its power.
Right. Yeah, and I would just add that this film is a great example too of the way that Eisenstein used film to convey these propagandistic messages. I mentioned earlier, the notion of Soviet montage, and Eisenstein uses this throughout this entire film. I would also add that he does this a lot in his other 1925 film Strike, which I think is another favorite of mine as well. One of the great ways to see an example of this is in one of the early scenes, the men and the maggots scene, where it shows these sailors who are about to mutiny because they've been given spoiled meat to eat. And you see Eisenstein cuts from the sort of distressed faces of these sailors to images of the spoiled meats, and the meat it's disgusting. It has like maggots actually crawling in it, and that's what they're given. And then it also then cuts to the evil faces of these leaders who are giving them this bad meat. So by cutting, doing this sort of rapid cutting style between these different images, he's essentially making an argument that these people need to rise up and against their oppressors. So Eisenstein saw film as this very unique way to get across Marxist ideas.
And it's dialectical too, isn't it? I mean, the montage,
Absolutely.
the montage itself is a sort of a form of dialectics, right? It's point, counterpoint, and synthesis, or how whatever terminology we want to use, right? You have the image followed by oftentimes its opposite, followed by what? The sensation that that creates, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the great examples of this can really be seen in his movie Strike, where he shows these workers being oppressed, and then he immediately juxtaposes that with shots of cows being slaughtered, and then it immediately goes to the workers then rising up against their oppressors. So, and Eisenstein does this, of course, purposely, and you can, if you read his works, he talks about his theory of film as a dialectical process.
Yeah, and I mean we can think of 1,000 examples throughout film history, and you know, planes flying overhead to symbolize war or whatever it might be, right? All of those are, in one sense or another, references back to Eisenstein.
Yep. You mentioned the Odessa steps sequence. This is another example of that, where you have in this scene, and anyone who hasn't seen the film could easily find this exact scene on YouTube. So I recommend watching that. But you have these soldiers who are marching down the steps in this very inhuman, almost like robotic display of oppression. You don't even see their faces. It's just pure oppression, marching down these stairs, and they're slaughtering these droves of innocent people and creating this massacre. But then you go you cut back and forth between the actual faces of the oppressed people, and I don't want to say too much about it so people can actually experience it for themselves. But I will add that another aspect of this is that the score that was played during these scenes also corresponded to the action being seen on film, which again, from a film history perspective, was an innovative was an important innovation. What the person who originally scored Battleship Potemkin was a man, Edmund Meisel, and who used to actually do scores for Brecht's plays. So, of course, another left wing person. But Eisenstein actually guided him in his composition to make sure that the rhythm of his music corresponded to the action being seen on screen. Now, that's something that we take for granted now in film. It's commonplace. But again, you have to kind of put yourself back in time and think about early cinema history to see how innovative Eisenstein really was with this movie.
There's so much more we could say about that. We could talk about Odessa, which is where my family comes from. You could go back and listen to my uncle's interview on this show. We talk all about Odessa for an hour and a half, about internationalism, what Odessa represented, how it was probably the most multicultural of all cities in the Soviet Union, what that represents, etc. But I think we probably should move on from there. Shalon, why don't you give us one of your films? I guess since we're just doing the silent films, we might as well just do that. What's your early Soviet film that you selected in your top five all time Russian/Soviet films?
Well, in my top five, one of the first ones I picked was a 1930 film by Alexander Dovinsko, which is Earth. It's just titled Earth. Now, this movie, I believe you can probably find it on YouTube, but essentially, there's not much of a plot in this movie. This There's a somewhat of a plot. Essentially, it's looking at the situation of the peasants, which was an important in Russian history, an important situation that the Soviets had to figure out. So, really, this film is more about a celebration of life, of death, the harvest, but mostly the people working together collectively. So, that theme that I mentioned earlier comes out especially so in this film. But what is probably the biggest theme in this movie is the idea that collectivization would bring the people this new future, and this that collectivization was important, and that the kulaks, the wealthy peasants, were considered and are portrayed in the film as class enemies. So that's essentially the main idea of the film. But really, the film is more of a sort of visual poem. So it's a beautifully filmed. It's wonderful to watch, and it begins by showing the earth. So the title of the film, it shows these large fields, and it starts by showing a woman next to a tall sunflower, and it's almost as if she is growing out from the ground herself. So you have these connections with the people and the land, this motif of fruits and flowers and vegetables and agriculture throughout the entire film, because that's really the key idea that they're trying to get across here. One of the most interesting things about Earth is that everything is contrast with its opposite. So you see all these clashes between old and new. You see images of oxen versus images of tractors. You see these old class structures contrasted with communism. You see religion versus atheism. You see the individual versus the collective. So these opposite ideas are contrasted throughout and juxtaposed throughout the entire movie, which are supposed to, put you on the side of collectivization, of industrialization, and put you thinking that the kulaks were essentially, as Lenin considered them, class enemies of the revolution.
There's a number of things to talk about, and I'm actually going to reference back to Devchenko and Earth a little bit later in talking about one of my other films. But the interesting thing about this film and thinking, first of all, as you mentioned, flowers and fruits and vegetables, and I mean, ultimately at a broad level, it's not any secret, fertility, right? And about
Mhm.
women and about women's role. Women are, to a large extent, very prominent, not only in the film, but prominent as it relates to the peasants' place within the new political institutions of the new Soviet Union, right? I mean, 1930, you're already like 13 years later, but I mean, it's easy to forget that the Bolsheviks weren't the political party that was rooted in the peasantry. They were rooted in the cities, right? The
Mhm.
left SRs and other political formations that had been rooted in the peasantry, in the countryside. And so, in some senses, this focus on, in Earth, on agriculture and on the peasantry is kind of one of the ways of sort of the Bolshevik propaganda, communist propaganda, basically saying, like, no, we're not, we understand what the peasants are and their place and role in society.
Yep.
In other words, that we're not just, urban Bolsheviks who are, strictly understanding things in terms of a proletarian dictatorship, right? That there is class conflict in the countryside, that class war has to be imported into the countryside. I mean, that is what led to the mass collectivization and, well, the liquidation of the kulaks.
Right. Yeah. Then the idea of class conflict comes up a lot in this movie, and also, importantly, the idea of generational conflict. So one of the contrasts you do see in the film is this conflict between the son and the father, and it shows the father as sort of thinking in the old ways of things, whereas the son is part of this new generation that what would often be referred to as the concept of the new Soviet person, which I'm sure you'll talk about when you talk about another one of the films you're going to mention. But this idea comes up a lot in this movie, and you see that the father in the film is hesitant to accept sort of the new ways of machinery and whatnot. He's tied to these sort of old ways of working the land. One of the great scenes from this that sort of illustrates this idea is this celebration of the tractor. When they get a tractor, it's being celebrated. by the younger generation. And at first, you start to think, oh, it's going to be a problem because when they try to start the tractor, it doesn't work. But then in this sort of funny scene, they decide to actually urinate in the tractor, and because it didn't have any water in it, and then all of a sudden the tractor works, and then it flashes to a subtitle that says, "May we prosper with the machines." So you have these shots of agriculture being performed afterwards, and it shows this sort of tedious, hard labor. But then all of a sudden, it shows how quickly things can be done and how efficient things can be done with the machine. So these conflicts, these multi-layered conflicts, I should say, you see throughout this beautifully filmed movie.
It also reminds me, as going back to something you said a few minutes ago, Shalon, about Lenin's understanding of cinema as the most important of the artistic media. Primarily, I think, to a large extent, you know, you see that over and over again, where a lot of the, let's call them, theoretical sort of concepts of Marxism and of Marxist analysis and things like that, that somehow become a little bit more universalized through film, right? So as you were
Mhm.
talking about, I mean, you wouldn't expect necessarily your average peasant to understand the theory of combined and uneven development or something like that, but they can certainly understand an ox next to a tractor,
Right.
you know.
And an important point about that too is that many of the peasantry at this time were still illiterate. So, you couldn't really reach people with the written word as well as you could with the visual that they could see through cinema. So, film as is predominantly a visual medium, and it's able to convey those ideas universally without any written language.
Absolutely. Well, as we're coming up against the clock, I said we weren't going to spend the entire first half talking about only silent films, and yet here we are doing exactly that. I promise you, listeners, we are not only talking about silent films from the 1920s. There are plenty more that we're going to discuss. But before we go to the break, I guess I will go to my next film, which is a silent film. It is, well, in my opinion, one of the most important films of the Soviet avant garde. Certainly, maybe one of the most important films of any country in the 1920s. I would maybe say one of the most important films ever made, and that would be The Man with the Movie Camera, Dziga Vertov. This film is, I mean, what do we want to say about it? I don't want to spend too much time on it because there's a lot's been written. It's been shown over and over again in many places. I'm sure many people have seen it, but Man with the Movie Camera is not exactly a narrative film. It's not exactly a documentary. It's kind of, I don't. It's kind of a visual poem, an ode to the new Soviet Union, an ode to cities, an ode to proletarian revolution, an ode to technology, an urban pastoral, whatever you There's many different terms you could use to describe it, but basically, this is a film that uses many of the conventions that we would come to associate with the art movement of constructivism, that imports those into filmmaking for the purposes of not simply documenting a day in the life of a Soviet city, but in documenting something like the new, what you were saying, the new Soviet person, right? The new Soviet citizen, right? And this is sort of the I don't know, what would we call it, Shalin? The new day in the
Well,
life of Soviet
yeah.
citizenry.
I think that works. And the concept of the new Soviet person was essentially someone who had shaken off the shackles of the old world, the things like religion and superstition or traditional bourgeois social values. And instead, there's someone who have embraced the new modernized Soviet world. So, you this idea is, someone born into this new generation who's free from all that baggage of the old regime. And then in this movie you see young people sort of just living this life of that's free of that old world. That their life has been changed by machinery, and they're active and they're athletic and they're modern, and so and it's just sort of these splicing together of footage of all these people doing these kinds of things.
But it's yes, and it is more than that too, right? Because it is
Right.
also the life of the life of humans, but it is also the life of the city itself as almost a
Mhm.
living organism, right? With the different trams and railways and things going in perpendiculars and parallels and all kinds of different directions. So there's this kind of angular sort of camera. Sometimes it's elevated, sometimes it's down low, sometimes it's moving, sometimes objects are moving in front of it. We see a lot of that, but to your point, it's not just young people engaging in new activities. You see a literal birth on
Mhm.
screen in this
Yes.
film. You see actual death in this film, right? Isn't I believe there's at least one or two animals that get slaughtered in the movie. There is there's a lot of sort of symbolic language that is very politically charged throughout this film. And like I said, I mean, although Potemkin is historically probably the most important of all of the films of this period, for me, Man with the Movie Camera is the most artistically daring. It is certainly the most avant-garde, and it is the one that you watch it today and you almost can't believe it was 100 years ago.
Right. You mentioned how, Potemkin, it was, important cinematically, but this film, Man with a Movie Camera, Vertov also created, like Eisenstein, he also created a lot of important innovations in film that have become commonplace today, such as like multiple exposures, where you're seeing like two different or more than two layers of things happening at the same time, layered upon each other. This idea of fast motion and slow motion interacting with each other. The idea of freeze frames, which again, these are sorts of things that we take for granted in film now, but Vertov was one of the first people to push forward this innovation. Jump cuts, people who talk about cinema and they think about people like Godard, who, in 1960 with his movie Breathless, was very innovative with the French New Wave and creating jump cuts. Well, Vertov also had jump cuts in this movie that came out 30 years prior. So there's all these, the splicing of scenes together, all sorts of innovations from a cinematic perspective that Vertov is using in this film too.
Yes, absolutely, and again, Men with the Movie Camera, like Battleship Potemkin, also features the city of Odessa, which is where my family comes from, and of course, like I said, an international port city, one that had a certain kind of cultural resonance within the Soviet Union that many other cities did not. I mean, you know, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, being the longtime capital, the cultural heart of the country, Moscow, the old capital, the historic, the Kremlin, etc. But Odessa was one of those western facing cities in Ukraine on the Black Sea. There were Greeks and Turks and all kinds of people who were milling about in Odessa. So one of the things that you see in Man with the Movie Camera is sort of the complexity of urban life in the Soviet Union.
Hmm. One of the things that Vertov was part of this group of filmmakers known as the Kinox, or the Kino Eyes, you could say, which one of their main goals was to abolish any style of filmmaking that wasn't documentary style, and so it just kind of talks about how how important it was for them to portray these things as real life, like this is the real life promise that Soviet communism will bring. This is the real life promise that Soviet modernism will bring you. And that was kind of one of the main ideas that he wanted to get across in this film.
A cinema of material reality.
Exactly.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break. It's already, good Lord, we're at 37 minutes. Okay, we're definitely going to take a break here. On the other side of the break, we have a lot to talk about, including films that actually have sound, believe it or not. So
That's right.
we're gonna talk about a bunch more movies that you absolutely must see. Chatting with Shalon van Tine about our all-time favorite Russian and Soviet films. Go to her website, shalonvantine.com. SHALONVANTINE.com is the website. We will be right back.
Everybody's a dreamer, and everybody's a star, and everybody's in movies. It doesn't matter who you are. There are stars in every city, in every house and on every street. And if you walk down Hollywood Boulevard, their names are written in concrete. Don't step on Greta Garbo as you walk down the boulevard. She looks so weak and fragile, that's why she tried to be so hard. But they turned her into a princess, and they sat her on a throne. But she turned her back on stardom, because she wanted to be alone. You can see all the stars as you walk down Hollywood Boulevard. Some that you recognize, some that you've hardly even heard of. People who worked and suffered and struggled for fame. Some who succeeded and some who suffered in vain. Looks very much alive, and he looks up ladies' dresses as they sadly pass him by. Avoid stepping on Bela Lugosi, 'cause he's liable to turn and bite. But stand close by Betty Davis, because hers was such a lonely life. If you covered him with garbage, George Sanders would still have style. And if you stamped on Mickey Rooney, he would still turn round and smile. But please don't tread on dearest Marilyn, 'cause she's not very tough. She should have been made of iron or steel, but she was only made of flesh and blood. All the stars as you walk down Hollywood Boulevard. Some that you recognize, some that you've hardly even heard of. People who worked and suffered and struggled for fame. Some who succeeded
And we are back chatting with Shalon van Tine, going through our favorite all-time Russian and Soviet films. So, Shalon, we've delved deeply into the 1920s, the early period of Soviet cinema. Where are we going next?
Well, let's go into the 1950s. I'd like to talk about one of my all-time favorite films, which is by Michael Kalatozov. And I also apologize for any Russian names that I mispronounce in the show.
I'm
Um,
silently snickering and judging you from behind the
yes, I
microphone,
felt
of course.
it.
That's why
um,
that's why I use German names when we talk
there
into
you
the
go. There you go. Well, this movie is a 1957 film called The Cranes Are Flying. And I believe that if anyone has a Criterion Channel subscription, I believe that it's a permanent fixture on there. Now, this movie is a beautiful movie, and I don't want to say too much about the plot, but I'll give a brief what the plot's about. The plot is really about this character Veronica and Boris, and they're in love. But Boris volunteers for the war, gets sent on a dangerous mission, um, and then the wedding that they had hoped for never comes to pass. And we actually don't even really see Boris through most of the film, but he's sort of there in these other ways, through memories, through some other things I won't go into. But really, what's important about this film in the history of Russian cinema is that this film came out after the thaw, and you start to see in this period of Russian film, you see less talk about these sort of collective, explicitly political sorts of things that you saw with things like Battleship Potemkin. In these um, films that came out after the thaw, they're more focused on your psyche and psychological themes, more personal themes. So this movie is more about how the cruelty of war and the damage of war affects the Soviet psyche, as well as the individual's psyche, and all these sorts of effects of war that are not necessarily only political, but it also shows how war affects the person. So what this film does is it really shows how Veronica started with this very youthful optimism. Boris starts with this very youthful idea of heroism. And I'll say that this is, of course, set during World War II, or in Russia, the Great Patriotic War. And what happens throughout the film is that these sort of youthful notions just get deteriorated away, and they're just broken down and broken down. And there's so much visual symbolism, and like many of the other films I like, it's very much a visually poetic film. But what happens in the end is that Veronica is sort of redeemed um, by by getting a sort of symbolic replacement for the Boris that she loved. And you can also think about this in another way, which is that her sort of youthful optimism, which was destroyed throughout the film, there's sort of a sense of hope again at the end. So what do you have to say about this film, Eric? I know you recently rewatched it.
Oh boy, yeah, I've seen Cranes Are Flying at least a half a dozen times. I mean, this is one of my favorite films. Um, One of the things that struck me the last time I watched this, which was just last week, because I was trying I was trying to see all these movies before we talked, and I of course failed at that. But Cranes Are Flying, I own on Blu-ray. So, what can I say about it that you didn't already mention? I think one is that it really it helps to bring into a sort of stark relief for non-Russians what World War II meant for Russian people. I mean, that this was not only, all out total war, as I'm going to talk about with two of my other films that I selected, but that this was a war that destroyed a lot of young people and young lives, right? And that is ultimately what the Cranes Are Flying is about, right? This isn't really about love. It's about the loss of love, the death of love,
Yes.
right? It is about losing the one that you love because of this great national trauma that everyone was going through. And one of the personal connections that I feel watching this movie is my own grandmother, because her story is very, very similar, not in the sense of the tragic loss of her love, but I mean in the sense of the evacuation. You see the families, the women, the elderly, the children children who are in the city of Moscow, which is where the story begins. They are packed onto trains in one of the biggest evacuations in the history of the world. And my grandmother was one of the millions of Soviet citizens who was packed up onto trains and sent east of the Ural Mountains to spend out the years of the war in some remote town living in sub-zero temperatures, just as you see in the film. So it's very real. It's a very
Mhm.
real film that accurately captures a lot of the trauma and displacement of the war, and yet simultaneously it's also it's a visually exhilarating movie. And I almost had forgotten how visually risky the movie is. I
Mhm.
mean, this is a film that comes out after what, Shalon, at least 20 years of the Soviet film industry languishing in a kind of a pretty reactionary, certainly not innovative position on the global stage. And then here comes this film with, well, let me just point to one particular scene of sexual aggression by the
Mhm.
antagonist against Veronica that is extraordinarily powerful as it's juxtaposed against what's a bombing raid, a Nazi bombing raid that's happening outside the window, and bombs are exploding in light and dark and flashes, and at the same time he's sexually assaulting her. It's an extraordinarily powerful scene that it's almost shocking, even 60 plus years later. It's quite shocking, actually.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that scene. So, you have this scene where a little context. So Veronica, the main character, is in love with this character Boris, who goes away to war. And in that scene where she's essentially raped by his cousin, by Boris's cousin, and then at the same time you see this bombing. So this juxtaposition is obviously making a huge statement. But there's sort of more to that. That's not the end of this horrific event. The cousin who rapes her essentially guilts her into marrying him. Tries to pressure her into marrying him out of guilt. So there's this sense that, like, even though she was the victim, he is trying to make her feel guilty, by almost as if she let herself get raped.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
it's this awful psychological damage that's being done to her, in addition to the actual damage, in addition to the actual war damage that's happening all at the same time.
Well, and just to add a little more context, people should understand this is after an extreme trauma has just happened to her not long before this, right? So she's stumbling from one trauma to the next, right? And then
Mhm.
this forced marriage is almost a form of capitulation.
Yes.
Uh,
And there's also this theme that you see throughout about guilt as well, where she feels like she has portrayed Boris, even though throughout the whole film she still believes that he's alive and coming back, but she still feels this sense of betrayal. And the family, she doesn't tell the family, Boris's family, who take her in, because she really has nowhere else to go, because her family was or she's orphaned because her family was killed in the war. The family kind of thinks she's a terrible person, for being with the cousin, not knowing that he raped her. She doesn't tell them about that. So she already has to live with this sense of guilt, even though she doesn't deserve it. And then she also works as a nurse helping soldiers. And there's these soldiers sort of talking amongst themselves about women who leave men when they've gone away to war, and they're just one of the guys says that broads like that are worse than fascists. So you see, and then it shoots to her face, and you see just this intense guilt, but she can't tell anybody why she feels so terrible, or even defend herself, because it would require her explaining this entire thing. So there's so many layers of emotional trauma that this film conveys in amazingly beautiful way somehow.
Yeah, I have so much more I would say about that. Even that scene that you just pointed to, specifically who it is that is delivering that monologue, makes it
Yes.
so much more painful. It's a That scene is just an absolute dagger in the heart to watch. But
Yeah.
I I'm trying not to do spoilers. Like Potemkin, it's like, okay, what am I giving a spoiler for 100-year-old movie here? But Cranes Are Flying, Cranes Are Flying, I think many people may have not seen. And so I'm definitely going to not spoil it. But I will say that the scene that you just mentioned is a particularly tough one, as is one of the scenes towards the end when a soldier comes back from the war and finds her and to deliver some news. And the way that that happens is really just soul crushing in a lot of ways. But the last thing I just want to point out on the cinematic side of this, the technical side, there's a couple of things that really struck me in this last time that I was watching. That, well, they struck me every time, but particularly this last time. There are two scenes in particular where Veronica is going through a crowd trying to
Mhm.
find Boris. One
Yes.
is when he is departing, when the volunteers are getting onto the trains to go off to, combat training, and all of their loved ones are there seeing them off. And Veronica, for reasons that I won't explain here, is late and is unable to get there. And so there's this scene, and it's actually kind of harrowing in a weird way, where she's just winding her way through this massive people, and the camera is just tracking shot along with her through
Mhm.
this crowd. And what's amazing about it, considering 1957, the sound editing, I mean, you go in and out of these conversations like as if you're just eavesdropping, like you're there in the crowd. It is a very sort of viscerally sort of impactful scene. And then just similarly, at the end of the film, she's going through a crowd for yet another reason, trying to find Boris, that is also extremely emotionally powerful, but also cinematically, it's visually powerful. And the sound, again, this reminds me of what we were talking about with Potemkin, where in Potemkin, you don't really see the individual. You don't have an individual. It is simply the masses, right?
Mhm.
As a collective. Whereas here, 33 years later, Soviet film has progressed. The political situation has changed, and you do start to get the individual. You get the psychological aspects of these human beings. That component, I mean, that is what I think makes Cranes Are Flying one of the greatest films ever.
I agree. I completely agree.
Well, good. I'm glad we agree on that. Okay, so then we will move on to to another film that I think is one of the greatest films ever made. I think many people would agree, even though I'm not sure it's even the best film made by this filmmaker. It is Andrei Rublev. It is 1966. Andrei Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky, of course, the poster boy for the Soviet New Wave. Tarkovsky, the great protege of Bergman, the toast of the European art house cinema circuit of the 1970s and 80s. If you're a film person and you know anything about Russian films, you probably know Tarkovsky. But Andrei Rublev, in my opinion, is much less understood by Western audiences. This is a film that, unlike Solaris and Mirror and Stalker, which are probably three of the better known Tarkovsky films, this film is very uniquely Russian in its orientation, in its subject matter, in the way that it approaches the subject matter. I mean, put simply, this is a film that takes place over the course of a lifetime in the early 15th century. So, the very early 1400s we're talking about. You're talking about a period in Russia before a real modern Russia has emerged, before Ivan the Terrible, before the consolidation of what we would think of as modern Russia. And yet, this film is not even really about Russia itself, not in a political sense, but in some ways, I would say it's probably the best illustrate. Well, I'm going to quote my own father here. My dad saw this movie at a movie theater in Odessa in 1972, I believe, which was when it was first released in the Soviet Union, because it had been censored for, I believe it was 7 or 8 years that they shelved the film for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to go into now. But in any event, when it was finally shown, my dad basically said that he sat in the movie theater just with his jaw on the floor. He said it was the most impressive film he had ever seen. It was the best film about Russia that he had ever seen, and he says that even to this day. So, what is it about Rublev that is so extraordinary? Well, number one is that I think it really touches on what Russia is and what is the essence of quote unquote Russianness. Um, One of the ways that it does that is by sort of talking about this, the idea of trying to break free of forms of oppression and control. Right, you see that from the very beginning of this movie. The movie is broken up into essentially like chapters with a prologue and an epilogue. The prologue and the epilogue are not even really part of the story proper. They are essentially almost like little shorts that act as something like bookends. But basically, the movie is, for all intents and purposes, it's about art. It's about the creation of art, and it's about the ability or the desire to essentially create art and to birth art across generations. And what you see from the beginning of the film, Andrei Rublev is an icon painter. That is somebody who goes from town to town, city to city, painting cathedrals, painting icons of Christ and so forth. And Rublev is traveling across a country that is just in the early stages of being finally and permanently controlled by the Orthodox Church, right? And there's a very powerful scene in this film of pagans living in the forest, and these pagans and what they represent. I won't get into all of the subtext of that, but the pagans of the forest represent something like a wild and untamed nature, right? One that Christianity and Eastern Orthodox Christianity does not abide. Pagans as sort of wild beings free of the control of Christian morality. Andrei Rublev, of course, being this devout Christian artist. I don't, like I said, I don't want to give away too much, but this is really a movie about freedom. It is a movie about hope. The movie begins with essentially, an inventor, a tinkerer, trying to invent a hot air balloon to escape from his surroundings, from his landscape. And what happens to him, and his brutal end is, I think, a very good introduction to the film. The film is very brutal in a lot of ways. Some of the scenes, particularly when the Tatars come and sack a particular village, is extraordinarily brutal. But ultimately, I think the film it's about Christ, Jesus. It's about sacrifice. Let's see, Andre. One of the quotes I wrote down from Andrei Rublev talking about Jesus, where he says, "Perhaps he was born and crucified for one reason: to reconcile God with man." Right, and this spiritual journey and the artist's journey, that's what Rublev is about. It's about something that is uniquely Russian, and you see this in Dostoevsky, you see it in Russian literature, you see it in Russian poetry, in Tolstoy and elsewhere. Right, the crushing of hope and the need to struggle to remain hopeful. This is what Rublev is to a large extent about. Um, I don't know. I could go on and on. You've seen it, Shalon, right?
Oh, absolutely, many
So talk.
times.
So tell me about. Okay. So tell me about Rublev. Tell me what you think, and maybe what you think I might have not mentioned there.
I mean, well, where does one start with Tarkovsky anyway? But Tarkovsky, one of the great directors of all time, and especially of Russian cinema. And one of the things that makes him so unique is that, of course, he came, like you mentioned, during the time when Russian film was sort of undergoing a different style and change. Tarkovsky, he didn't focus so much on politics. He focused on, although don't get me wrong, political everything is always saturated throughout, whether it's explicit or not. But he definitely focuses on the psyche in all of his films. And one of the things that sort of sets Tarkovsky apart, and this is just generally speaking, is he has a very sort of transcendent relationship to nature. And he, in every one of his films, nature plays a key role. And oftentimes nature is sort of living in a universe unto itself. Humans are doing human things, and nature is sort of unaffected and indifferent to it. You can see this in Andrei Rublev. You mentioned how the film is broken up into 8 chapters. Those can also be broken down into 4 different thematic sections based on the natural elements as well. So, you have this first section that focuses on wind. One of the, early scene in the film shows a medieval man like on a parachute. And there's this, great sort of aerial shot that you get. And also you get the sense too, keeping in mind that this is during the Middle Ages. So this is like a man is flying. And then you see the next section that focuses on water. All those scenes have rain in them and
But can we
rivers.
back up, Shalon? Why is he
Yes.
flying? Why is he flying?
Well, what do you think?
Well, I'm not trying to ask that in a trick question sort of way. I mean to say that he's flying because on the one hand, he's quote unquote trying to invent the hot air balloon in a
Right.
sense, right?
Hmm.
But on the other hand, he's trying to escape.
Yes.
There's a massacre going
Yep.
on. You know what I mean?
And
And yeah, so to me, it's just this need to escape from the crushing the forces of your impending doom.
yes. Yeah, and that, like you said, that is, this theme of artistic freedom goes throughout this entire movie. And of course, this corresponds with Tarkovsky making films, and he had a hard time making films in the Soviet Union at this time, because his films were seen as often too formalistic or excuse me, too formulaic, and or not formulaic. That's not what I meant to say. Uh, too artsy. Let's just say that. So you have this character who is trying, like you said, trying to escape from this repression. And you do see that throughout the whole movie. And I'll just mention that you see these other sort of natural themes of fire, earth, water, fire. One of the last scenes, I won't go too much into it, but they're building this bell in the ground, in the clay. So this connection with nature is something that you see throughout Tarkovsky's films generally. But in this particular film, he's especially concerned with the nature of art and creating art and what that means. And you'll notice this sort of contrast between Rublev and his apprentice Foma throughout the film. And for those of your listeners who aren't too familiar with sort of art history from the medieval period, medieval painters and artists up until the Renaissance weren't really considered artists in the way that we think of artists now, as like these sort of individual sort of genius-like figures. That most artists up throughout the medieval period were considered skilled workers. They were artisans. They learned a particular skill of painting. And icon art was didactic, meaning it was meant to convey specifically Christian themes. It wasn't meant to delve too much into the emotions of the subjects. And that's why when you do get to the Renaissance period, you start to see that change as Renaissance artists started looking back more towards the ancients and focusing more on emotion and things like that. So you have this character towards the end of the Middle Ages And I don't know if you mentioned this already or not, but Rublev was a real person. So, this isn't a made up character. So you have this person through at the end of the Middle Ages who is, sort of caught between the age where art was just a skill, which is, portrayed in the character of Foma, who just is a very sort of salt of the earth kind of person, just thinks of art as a skill that you learn, versus wanting to express yourself, wanting to express your artistic creativity, and express your sort of inner knowledge, and enlightened ideas through your art, but are sort of repressed. There's this great scene where Rublev is sort of contemplating the meaning of art, and he's trying to figure out, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says something along the lines of, is art for God or is art for profit? And, of course, we can relate to what he's talking about there. I mean, is art something that is a transcendent creative experience, and it's good in its own sense, or something that glorifies, good values, or whatever you want to call that, or is it just a commodity? So these are there's so much happening in this movie. It's like you said, it's hard to kind of really talk about everything.
Oh, I mean, yeah, and don't get me wrong, the movie is very, very long. This is not a, very quick affair. And I just want to highlight a couple of other points for us to discuss here before we move on. One is, as you were kind of talking about, and I think I was mentioning as well, about it is about art and about artists and about intergenerational art, right?
Hmm.
That is to say, the passing of skills and knowledge and of sort of the mantle of artistic creation from one to the next, right? Because the story essentially follows the arc of Andrei Rublev from the time when he is, I don't know if he's technically an apprentice, but a young painter, to the point where he essentially is sort of passing on, this sort of artistic spark to the next one, as you were alluding to the story of the bell maker, right?
Hmm.
And at the end, I mean, without giving anything away, I mean, Andre also kind of re-emerges from a very long self-imposed exile from his art to sort of rediscover his art. And ultimately, the movie it's about Russia, and it is unique to Russia, but it is also about art and artistic creation. And moreover, I think it's about vision. It's about ways of seeing, right? Because, like, for instance, and I think Tarkovsky's films are all in a sense about ways of seeing and different ways of seeing things, right? Because Andrei Rublev rather sort of shockingly or visually sort of smacks you across the face when it switches from black and white to color. And
Yeah.
and and Tarkovsky does that in multiple films of his, where that move in the mirror from that sepia black and white to color, or in Stalker from the black and white outside the zone, color inside the zone. I mean, this
Mhm.
is this is Tarkovsky, and this is Tarkovsky asking us to really think about how we see and how we view what it is that's on the screen and what it is that's in our own minds.
There's something that came to mind when you said that, which is this focus on a sort of visionary kind of character, and it's reminds me of the way Herzog often focuses on those kinds of characters, people who are in some ways kind of like a holy fool kind of character, which Tarkovsky loves that holy fool concept, which comes up in all of his films as well. But someone who sort of has dreams bigger than himself, is something that you can see in things like Herzog's Fitzcarraldo or Strozik, so that kind of idea, it also plays out in this movie as well. It's just this someone who can see beyond his own time, his own limitations.
There's so much more to say about Rublev, but we're well over an hour and we still have more films to talk about. So do yourself a favor and get yourself a Blu-ray, 4K, Ultra HD, whatever you can, to get a good print of Andrei Rublev and spend 3 hours of your life in engaging with it because it's so awesome. All right, Shalon, what's your next one?
Well, what would you think? I could talk about another Tarkovsky film, or I could talk about another Kaltazov film. So, what would you prefer?
Oh, why don't you surprise us?
All right. Well, how about let's go? Let's go to 1964. Well, we'll go to 1964, and we'll talk about a film called "I Am Cuba," or often referred to as "Soy Cuba." Now, this is a Soviet-Cuban production by Michael Kaltazov. So it is shot in black and white. Now, I do want to note, though, it's not just any black and white. The film was obtained from actually the Soviet military. So it's an infrared film. So it has a very unique sort of coloring or saturation, I should say, where, the sky almost looks very white. And the shots are in these like very darkly contrasted shots, and a lot of these shots are filmed in these very wide angle shots. It's a Soviet and Cuban production film, essentially about. It's not about the Cuban Revolution, but it's sort of about the Cuban Revolution in spirit. It's the spirit of the Cuban Revolution, I'll say. But this film is essentially broken down into 4 vignettes, which seems to be kind of a common theme that we keep coming across. But 4 vignettes. The first one is focused. Each one focuses on a particular person, but the person, very similar to Eisenstein earlier, represents a larger idea, of course. The first one focuses on Maria, who's a prostitute at an American bar in Cuba. The second one focuses on this guy Pedro, who is a farmer. The third one focuses on a student, Enrique, who's a revolutionary student. And the fourth vignette focuses on this character Mariano, who is a peasant who eventually joins the resistance. So this screenplay was actually written, and I should note that Che Guevara was actually a unofficial advisor to this film. It was commissioned by Cuba, by Kaltazov, after having seen the Cranes Are Flying. So, that movie that he made, of course, made a big impact from a cinematic perspective on Cuban film. So this screenplay was written to convey 4 main ideas. First, the effects of colonialism on Cuba. Second, it was meant to convey the tragedy of peasant life. Third, it was meant to convey the worker and the student struggle. And then lastly, it was meant to convey the struggles in the mountains and finally the triumph of socialism. So this film uses these different kinds of perspectives that all come together as a whole to represent socialism. Just like how in Eisenstein's Strike or Battleship Potemkin, the protagonist is not an individual character so much as an idea. It's the same here. And the protagonist of this film is revolution. So that's really the main idea. And when you the first opening shot is this amazing shot. I'm not even actually sure how it was completed. That pans over all these wealthy foreigners, and they're at like a pageant where these Cuban women are sort of walking through a pageant. They look sort of unhappy having to do it, but they're entertaining wealthy Westerners. And it pans through this whole image of these sort of this grotesque kind of wealthy colonial people, and then it sort of pans out and you start to see Cuba as a whole. And then there's a sort of disembodied voice that comes up over it saying that, I am Cuba. And Cuba speaks to you as if Cuba is a person, and talks over this, saying things like, thank you, Senor Columbus, you took my sugar and left me tears. And so this is sort of the introduction to this beautiful movie. And it essentially goes through these different vignettes, to convey all these ideas that I just mentioned, essentially in the end, hoping that you understand that revolution is required. So that's kind of the summary of this film, but I will just note that this is another film that is visually very poetic. It's one that you should watch for yourself and not just, read a summary of, because that would totally do it an injustice.
That shot during the beauty pageant. I mean, what the hell, man? How? How?
I don't even know how that shot was done.
Seriously, like
Because it's like
it doesn't
it's
make
like a
any
long
sense.
tracking shot, but then
Yeah,
it goes out into Cuba, almost like
into
in this aerial
midair.
shot. So
Yeah, it's
I,
like
I
floating
don't
in midair.
understand how that shot was
Well,
done.
what's interesting is that if you watch it now, I mean, if you didn't know better, you'd think they had a drone. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, how are they
Mhm.
doing that? It's incredible.
Right, but this is 1964, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the let me just ask you. I mean, it's been a while since I saw this. This is a movie that I saw a few times actually, but not in many years. So, remind me. First of all, answer this question. Talk a little bit about how the film demonstrates U.S. imperialism, Yankee imperialism, because I think that this is one of those rare instances where this is almost as overt as it will ever get in a Soviet film.
Absolutely. So, let me just kind of talk about some of the scenes that will answer your question. So, one of the first scenes, focuses on this character Maria, and she has a love interest. I don't remember his name. I apologize. And you only see him for a moment, and he sort of sees her as this sort of virginal kind of character. But then you fast forward, you see that she's actually a prostitute in a bar meant for wealthy Americans, and this it sort of shows all of these Cuban women who are prostitutes because they really have to. It's the only way that they can make any money. And the way that they're treated, they're just treated like they're just such commodities. They're sort of passed around between one American to the next. They're sort of forced to. There's this one scene where they're forced to do this dance, and it's like a Cuban dance, but they dance it around a kind of more indigenous statue. And meanwhile, you have like these sort of, laughing Americans who are just seeing this all as entertainment, even though she's doing something that's a more traditional indigenous dance. So all these juxtapositions are just throughout this entire film. And in this particular vignette, her customer, the American who purchases her for the night, wants to see where she lives, and against her better judgment, she decides to actually take him to where she lives, and she has to go through all this sort of um, urbanized area, and then finally gets to this rundown shack in this village where she actually lives. And there's this horrifying scene where, like, after they're finished, the American sees this cross that she wears. It's a beautiful cross that clearly means something to her in a religious, deeply spiritual sense. And he wants to purchase it from her just because he collects crucifixes. So it's this, he's taking this truly both spiritual and sentimental object of hers and treating it like it's just something that he can throw in his collection. And he gives her like $2 American for it, for this thing that's probably her most valued possession. And that's just the first vignette. Each one, really portrays this the effects of colonialism on Cuba. There's this wonderful scene where, in the scene that talks about the peasants, where the United Fruit Company um, tells the farmer who has lived on this land and worked this land his whole life, tells him, "Oh, your house isn't yours anymore. We sold it." And so I don't even really want to say too much, but let's just say that he he definitely takes matters into his own hands, as he should have. But just this sort of nonchalance with the United Fruit Company being like, "Oh well, this land, you've worked and lived here your whole life, but we just sold it, so it's no longer yours. So get out." And I mean,
Yeah, pretty
it's just,
much. Pretty
yeah,
much.
I can't even really describe so much of it in words, and there's so much tragedy that's in the faces of these characters as well. So absolutely watch this. This movie was also inspired by one of my favorite Eisenstein films that not many people talk about as much, called Que Viva Mexico, which is also very visually poetic kind of movie. So if that kind of imagery is the kind of thing that you're into, I highly recommend watching this one.
One last comment on this before we move on, because we're so far behind schedule here. But the other thing that I really, really connected with on this film when I first saw it when I was in college, and then again probably in about 2006 or so, um, is the poetics of the film. I mean, it's
Mhm.
not just a visual poem, quote unquote. I mean, it was literally co-written by the preeminent poet of the Soviet Union of the time, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who was, an international superstar at that point,
Yes.
and so you're talking about a film that enlists, an internationally recognized master film director, Kalatazov, who won, the grand prize at Cannes with Cranes Are Flying, what, 6 years earlier, 7 years earlier. You're talking about the preeminent Soviet poet of the day, Yevtushenko. So this is something that is unique. I almost can't. I don't know if I can even think of a parallel to that, where that brought together a master filmmaker and a master poet to make a movie like this.
Sure. Yeah, it's incredible.
Well, all right. So let's move on so that we can get done with this episode just shy of 4 hours. I'm kidding. It's only an hour 20 here, folks. The next film that I am going to discuss here, 1977, The Ascent, directed by Larissa Shepitko. So, a lot to say about this film. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut some of the analysis short a little bit and just point to a couple of things that I think are really interesting, and pointing back to something earlier in our conversation. Trivia time for you, Shalon. Here's a curveball.
Uh-oh.
Do you know who Larissa Shepitko studied under?
Wasn't it? It was one. It was Kalatazov, wasn't it?
No, it was
Or
not
it was.
Kalatazov.
I do know this at some point, but
Oh,
remind
that's
me.
okay. That's okay. I put you on the spot. I didn't give you a heads
You
up on it.
did.
She studied under Dovzhenko.
Okay. All right. You know what? I
Dovzhenko was
remember
her
that.
teacher. Of course, Eisenstein was famously, a teacher. Was taught many future filmmakers, and similarly, Dovzhenko also taught, and Shepitko was one of his students. She tragically dies in a car accident. I think she was only 41. I want to say it was 1979. So it was just after The Ascent had come out. The Ascent was an international sensation. This film was regarded as almost an instant masterpiece. It was, I believe, it won the top prize at the Berlinale Film Festival that year. I believe it was also special jury prize at Cannes. I'm not positive about that, but anyway, it was received to international acclaim. Shepitko is was the partner of Elem Klimov, who is another of the famous Soviet filmmakers of the New Wave period, along with Tarkovsky. They all knew each other. I don't know if they necessarily worked together, but they certainly went to film school together, were aware of each other and each other's work. So, in briefly talking about The Ascent, this film is really unique for a lot of reasons. One of which is obviously the almost overt religious subtext of the film. I mean, the film, the ascent references, I believe it's the ascent to Calvary, I want to say. It references the Holy Trinity. It references any number of Christian symbols and Christian ideas, which is powerful when you consider this is 1977 in the Soviet Union. This is not the kind of thing that you're supposed to speak about in in a film in the Soviet Union. So this was, in just in that sense alone, somewhat transgressive. Was Shepitko herself examining her own spirituality? Maybe. Was she using religion as a means of commenting on political themes that she might not have otherwise been able to comment on? I suppose that's an argument that people make. In thinking about the ascent, the cinematography is paramount. I mean, this film, this is just, it's viscerally incredibly powerful. I mean, what's the color palette? White and gray and more white, basically. I mean, the
Yeah.
movie is white. It is in the bleakest of bleak winter. It is all filmed outdoors in the cold. Shapitko had talked about why she made those decisions, why she put her actors and her crew through this like grueling ordeal. I mean, they're making a film in essentially in Siberia in the middle of the winter time. Um, so I did write down a great quote from her. She I believe this was in one of the great interviews that is on the Blu-ray edition of The Ascent, and I think it's also on the Criterion channel. You could see a great interview with Shapitko and a German interviewer where she's talking about this film, and she says, quote, "The annals of war made us realize that our most horrible ideas of what it was like paled before the inhuman realities. With the years, our memory spares our nerves and blunts our pain. We have tried to not only understand the pain, but to relive it." Right? This film is, in a sense, like a passion play almost, right? This is there's not a lot of hope here. There's not a lot of joy. There is a tremendous amount of pain and suffering and anguish. What you don't see in the movie, I don't know. I don't know if Shalon, you noticed this, or I didn't even notice it really the first time I saw the movie. But there's almost no Germans. I mean,
Yeah.
they really don't exist in the movie, to the extent that they're there as like an off-screen presence. And so it, on the one hand, it's about like sort of the brutalities of World War II, but it's not even really about World War II in a sense, because it's not even really the Germans who are doing this. It's almost them doing it to themselves, right? And
Hmm.
so it's about kind of treachery and hatreds and fear and pain and suffering and punishment and oppression and all of these things that can be meted out one against the other, neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, and so forth, right? So the film, it's not even, it's a war film, but it's not really a war film. It's brutal, but there's not a tremendous amount of on-screen violence. There's a direct reference to the film that you mentioned earlier, Dovzhenko's Earth. Her teacher, of course, she references it right in the opening scenes with
Hmm.
the fence posts, and the fence post that you see in The Ascent is a direct nod and reference to the fence post that you see in the opening scenes of Earth, and that reference would have certainly not been lost on educated film viewers who were watching the
Right.
film at the time. What else do I want to say about it? Like I said, it was shot in the middle of winter, to trying to recreate the conditions that these people faced. It's brutal, and I'm going to hold off on talking too much about the brutality, because my next film is even more brutal.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I don't have really much to add to it. It's one of those, again, another, I know this is a common theme with the movies that we like, but it's one of those ones that's best to see and rather talk about. But I think Shepetko said that she wanted all of her actors, who were all non-professional actors, I should add, to have an internal justification for everything that they did. So the film, even though it takes place, like you said, in wartime, it's not so much about war as it is about, these sort of very human, universally human internal conflicts. And you have, people trying to weigh out, the best action between, loyalty versus, betrayal versus self-survival, and then self-sacrificing versus, guilt, and self-imposed suffering. So there's all this, while it's conveyed through, the historical event of war, it's really more so about, the internal psyche of everyone. And like you mentioned, she had her actors do this in one of the most severe winter environments that you could, to really capture this. I'll just say one thing. You mentioned how there's that visual nod to Earth, and that it's this funeral procession that you see in Earth, that there's a direct visual nod to that in this movie. Your listeners might also be familiar with the director Dreyer, who directed one of the great films of all time, The Passion of Joan of Arc. And he also did a film called Vampire, about a vampire that does almost the exact same scene. So if you wanted to sort of compare those two images, that's something to do. I will just note there's one thing that really struck me about this film is I found it very unsettling. So for your listeners who like horror films, they might like this aspect of it, which is that there are many scenes where she has the character's face stare directly into the camera, and it has this very very unsettling effect. I don't know if you
Oh my
noticed that.
God, yes. Oh my God. Thank you for mentioning that. Yes.
Yeah, and this, it seems so simple, to just have the character stare into the camera like that, but it's very unsettling. And I could see that it probably influenced some horror directors later on. I didn't look that up to verify that, but that's just my guess.
No, I think you're dead on. That also really struck me too the first time I saw this. I was pretty late to this movie, to be honest with you. I considered myself something of a student of Russian film and of Soviet film, and I didn't see this one until fairly recently, and only rewatched it, a couple of months ago. And man, yeah, this movie is takes an emotional toll. That's for sure.
For sure.
All right, Shalon, what do you got? What's next?
Well, I think I can talk about my last film, which is another Tarkovsky film, which is The Mirror. This came out in 1975, and I will just, tell your listeners how we both fought over choosing this movie into our list, and I won. So, but Tarkovsky's The Mirror, probably one of my all-time favorite films ever. This movie, again, like most Tarkovsky films, it doesn't have a very solid plot. It's more of a visually poetic movie. But this film, if you wanted to describe what it's about, it's essentially it's about a dying poet, and you're sort of floating like a ghost through all of his childhood memories. That's the best way that I could think of to describe this film simply. Now, you never actually see the protagonist in this film. You only know who the protagonist is through his own dreams and his own memories. So that's a very unique way of focusing the film on the character without ever actually showing you the character. And of course, this is a highly autobiographical film. It's not explicit, it's not directly, but it's pretty obviously autobiographical. And Tarkovsky does talk a lot about the connections between this film and his own life in some of his books. But I will note that you mentioned earlier, the connection with Tarkovsky and father figures and generational kinds of ideas. Well, this also comes up a lot in this film. Throughout the film, Tarkovsky uses his own father's poetry. So his father was a well-known Russian poet, Arseny Tarkovsky, and his poems are used throughout the film that sort of narrate scenes that don't necessarily correspond with uh, with what you're seeing on the film, but of course there's a thematic correspondence there. But essentially, the film, it's nonlinear. It doesn't go in order. You're sort of floating around, seeing different memories and dreams of this poet. And then it does flash back and forth between the contemporary world and what he's remembering from his childhood. And like you mentioned earlier, he does slip between color and black and white and different sort of film stocks to kind of convey these issues. And he uses these sort of loose flow of visual images to kind of gives it a stream of consciousness technique. So it's almost like watching modernist literature, if you want to think of it like that. Um, the film does kind of jump between a few different time periods. You see the pre-war years, you see the 1940s, during World War II, and then you see the post-war years in the 60s and 70s. And so you see different memories, such as the evacuation from Moscow to the countryside during the war. You see his withdrawn father, and a lot about his mother. Um, and then it's also contrasted with his contemporary life. He has a few conversations with his ex-wife. Now, one of the interesting things about this film is that the wife and the ex-wife and the mother are played by the same actor. So there's a heavy Freudian kinds of idea happening throughout this film, where he often conflates the mother with his ex-wife, and you're not exactly sure if you're learning about the wife or you're learning about the mother, and so those lines are sort of blurred, which makes sense because the film is all about memory and language. And as we know, memory is highly deceptive, and we can't really rely on memory to give us an accurate picture. We color our own memories. And if your listeners are interested in Tarkovsky and sort of his views on film, they might be interested in reading his book Sculpting in Time, which talks a lot about this. And one of the main themes in that book is the nature of memory and how it's unreliable, how we color it. He even says that, we color our memories with poetry. So this sort of idea comes up a lot in this movie. And I'll also note, like I mentioned earlier with Andrei Rublev, there's a lot about man's connection to nature as well. And not in sort of obnoxious hippie way. It's in a very transcendent, natural, nature is sort of indifferent, but all around you, sort of a sublime kind of way, that you see throughout this entire film. So yeah, so what
You know,
I know we both love this film. So what do you have to say about it,
no,
Eric?
I mean, you hit all the major points. I'm going to throw a couple of questions or discussion points out at you. First, you said about nature. I think that's a great point. I mean, there's a number of scenes in this film. Tarkovsky actually, in several of his films, as he likes to use this motif of fire in the middle of a rainstorm. And
Mm-hmm.
and their famous scene in the mirror of this. I think it's his boyhood home, or it's the one
Yeah.
of the one of the structures on his boyhood home property on fire in the middle of a rainstorm, has this incredibly poetic sort of juxtaposition that just sticks with me. Now, one of the things I want to ask you, this going back and forth between black and white and color in the contemporary world, black and white in this sort of pre-war period. I always kind of, and I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I always kind of read that as also something like, the darkness and bleakness of the 1930s and the Stalin period, right? Because I mean, isn't Tarkovsky also commenting on that in the film? I mean, the mother, you remember how the mother frets
Mm-hmm.
about making a very minor mistake in the copy editing, and then it goes to the print, and then she's like running around like she's going to be summarily executed or something, right? Like this sort of this sort of extreme anxiety, all
Mhm.
colored in these dark shadows. And I don't know, is it sepia? It's probably not sepia. That's not the right word, but
Yeah,
that sort of,
I think he does use sepia.
yeah, it's like a sepia tone and this like
Yeah.
very dark and bleak visual appearance that to me is so reminiscent of that generation thinking back on their parents' generation. My my father the same way in talking about, his father going through the period under Stalin and how it was for, whatever. Anyway, what is your take on those scenes, the flashback from color in the present to the black and white of the past? Is there a political connotation to that? Am I reading too much into it? What do you think?
I don't think you're reading too much into it. I think there definitely is. I'll also add to that, which is that he also uses newsreel footage too. So, mixed in with things that he's actually filming, he's also mixing in old black and white newsreel footage. So that adds to that idea that you're trying to get across. Um, Not all the flashback scenes. Some of them are in color. I mean, if you think about that sort of famous scene with his mother on the fence, and so, but they he's definitely making a statement about Stalin. And you mentioned that scene where, to give a little context for your readers, his it's we gather through the film, nothing's ever explicit in a Tarkovsky film, but we gather that his mother works for a printing press, um, and she um, thinks that she accidentally printed something obscene about Stalin. They don't tell us exactly what it is, but it's sort of alluded to that it's something inappropriate, as a typo. And she, there's this great scene where she frantically runs to the printing press and goes through all the print to make sure. And then it turns out it was fine. It was just in her head. And I think Tarkovsky's talking about two different things here. One, he is making a sort of political statement, like you mentioned, but I think he's also talking about the nature of our psyche as well, the way that memories play tricks on us, the way that our mind plays tricks on us, and we see this a lot with the mother being juxtaposed with his ex-wife. In that particular scene, he had just gotten done, or he does afterwards, I can't remember which, talking to his ex-wife and basically calling her dramatic, saying that she reminds him of his mother, who was also dramatic. And in that scene, one of the co-workers of the mother basically accuses her of being histrionic and whatnot. So you have this. It's sort of like a dual layer symbolism happening here. Is his memories of the Stalin era, of the wartime, are these over dramatized, or are these accurate representations of what life was like uh, in Soviet Russia at this time? So you have these, the politics are sort of always there in the background, but he's also sort of looking at things in the way that a child looks at things, because so much of this movie is through his memories of seeing things as a child, and sort of figuring these things out and working them through from a child's perspective. So, which gets sort of muddled with these kind of, Freudian kind of symbolism and things like that.
Okay. In the interest of trying to keep it under 2 hours, why don't we move on? I think you said that you're on this film that was your last one, but I know you have one more, so you're just playing tricks on us.
Really?
Oh
What's
yeah,
my other one I'm missing?
Parajanov. Are you kidding me?
Oh, of course.
Of course. But before we could get to Parajanov, who I think is going to make for our grand finale, I think it's my turn, and I'm going to give my last one here. It's directly related to The Ascent, which I've already mentioned, and actually it's in some ways also related to a couple of other films that we've talked about. It is the most recent of all the films that we're talking about here today. It is called Idi Smatri, Come and See, 1985. Elem Klimov, the director. What a movie! I probably maybe I suppose you could make an argument for one or two other films, but I would say Come and See is probably the most brutal war film ever made.
I agree.
one of the most difficult films to watch. The fact that it's titled what it is almost a slap in the face. Come and see. I mean, boy, there's some stuff in here you don't want to see, but it is extremely powerful. It is a shocking film. It is brutal in every way. I didn't even really play up the violence and brutality aspect of Andrei Rublev when we were talking about it, but that film has moments of serious brutality at various times. But Come and See, I think, takes it to a whole other level. Of course, this is made in the 1980s, 1985. So you're talking in the Perestroika period. Much more openness, much more freedom in terms of the ability to make a film that was as daring as this one. I'm not going to even describe the various atrocities that the young protagonist, Flora, is subjected to. Needless to say, he is subjected to round after round after round of increasingly awful atrocities and just unspeakable evils that he witnesses and is subjected to, that you will have to endure as a viewer of this film. So talking a little bit about, like I said, the title, right? Come and See. It's almost forcing you to see what's on the screen, and it is the kind of subject matter that you do want to look away from. And if you are squeamish about those type of things, just know that going into this film. In talking about just some of the cinematic aspects of it, one of the things that strikes me again and again, I've seen this a couple of times now, it's the sound. The sound in this film is really, really something to pay attention to, because each time there's an explosion, it's like the sound changes, right? And it's changing along with the protagonist's hearing. So it's
Mhm.
like every time the bombs are exploding around him, it's like the ringing in his ears becomes the ringing in all of our ears, right? And that we're almost like we're subjected to some of the physicality that he has to sort of go through. And the actor, his name is Kravchenko. I mean, 14 years old, unbelievable performance. I almost can't even think of another teenage performance at that level. So in talking about the subject, I mean, again, it's similar to The Ascent. You're talking about Belarus in the war, the Nazis. Then, unlike in The Ascent, where the Nazis are basically non-existent, they're essentially a non-entity in that film. In this film, they are very much present, and they carry out some of the kinds of things that you shudder to even read about. So I don't know. I don't want to even get into the details of some of those things, Shalon, because that is for people to experience on their own. What do you want to say about Come and See?
Well, I'll just say that Come and See is a favorite film of mine. And for our podcast, I rewatched all the films except for this one because I was like, I can't
It's so
sit through
much.
this film
I
again, even
know.
though I love it. I think it's
I
an
know.
amazing film. It is the most brutal film I think I've ever
So hard.
seen.
Yeah.
And I've seen some pretty messed up films. Um, if the problem, one thing I'll note about this film is that there's always a problem, and this is a sort of common idea amongst people who talk about film a lot, is that it's difficult to make an anti-war film because in the process of making an anti-war film, you sort of indirectly uh, glorify war in some way, or you're sort of profiting off of a kind of tragic, unspeakable tragedy. I think if there's any film that can claim to be a truly anti-war film, it is this movie. It's so unrelentlessly brutal. It's just I can't even talk about all the different things. It's the kind of thing you have to experience, and it doesn't do it, and it's not realistic in the way that you tend to think of realism, where you're seeing exactly what's happening. It mixes a lot of this sort of like hyper realistic and surrealist almost scenes with very psychological and poetic and almost kind of like existential themes happening at the same time that all this brutal violence is happening. So, like I said, it's relentless. It's unforgettable. It's brutal. I will just quote something, if you don't mind me saying a quote that I liked. Um, Roger Ebert, who I only agree with like half the time. Half the time I don't like him, but he said something that I thought was really on point about this film that kind of captures it, and it speaks to the thing you were mentioning about sound. He said, "There's a curious scene here in a wood, the sun falling down through the leaves, when the soundtrack, which has been grim and mournful, suddenly breaks free into Mozart. And what does this signify? A fantasy, I believe, and not Flora's, who has probably never heard such music. The Mozart descends into the film like a deus ex machina to lift us from its despair. We can accept it if we want, but it changes nothing. It is like an ironic taunt." And I think that this really sort of captures what this film does. It sort of allows the audience watching it to have these moments that it needs to break free of this horrible thing that you're experiencing, even though the character themselves, that the character themselves cannot escape it. So
Shalon, I know that you are a lover and admirer of Bergman, and I didn't
yeah.
know until I read a little bit about. I didn't realize that "Come and See" comes from the Book of Revelation, where
Indeed.
Bergman also got his title for his famous 19 was it 1968?
57?
No. Well, there's Seventh Seal, and then he also references it in Shame, I think.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
shame.
but anyway,
Another
the
great anti-war film.
yes, and but it is let's see, where is it? I wrote it down. John, the Book of Revelations. When the Lamb of God opens the fourth seal of the scroll of Revelation, John hears, quote, "the voice of the fourth beast say, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him." And
Amazing.
I didn't realize that "Come and
Okay.
See" came from there. And
Yeah.
"Behold a Pale Horse," also a great film, also referenced from that. So I just thought that was interesting. So any Bergman parallels that you want to note?
That's funny. I didn't even think about Bergman's Shame, but that is a great anti-war film as well. I will just make a note that Tarkovsky was Bergman's favorite director. So if that says anything for anyone who's never seen Tarkovsky before but like Bergman, well, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Well, right, exactly. And ultimately, Tarkovsky ended up making films under the auspices of Bergman at the end of his career in Europe once he had left the Soviet Union. So
you know,
anyway,
you I was just going to say, you mentioned music, and music plays a big role in Tarkovsky's films too. Not to go backwards to one we already talked about, but in Tarkovsky's Mirror, you hear throughout Bach's St. John's Passion, and that composition, of course, the central theme of that is that that you see played sort of over and over throughout the movie is what's called the victory of the cross. This suffering that Jesus went through, and then there's of course the victory in the end. Um, and you do see in Mirror, the very last scene, there's like a sort of rusty looking cross, which I think is sort of a telephone line, but it's made to look like a cross, and it's the last thing you see in Mirror. So in Come and See, but then also in all these other movies we've been talking about after the thaw, you'll notice, or your listeners will notice, that there's a common theme where there is over and over religious themes. So you see this sort of harkening back to Christian mythology and iconography in all of these movies. And I think that speaks to how much the, you know, religion played a major role in the Russian psyche. And this is the kind of thing that during the Soviet period of film, they tried to sort of take out any references to religion. And if they did mention religion, it was they were making fun of the priest, or they were making fun of superstition and things like that. after the thaw, you see a lot more incorporation of these spiritual religious themes. And, I think that just speaks to sort of the Russian character, that you have to understand that religion played such the Orthodox Church played such an important part in Russian culture, that you start to see that in more of these later films.
I agree partially with that, although I would have a slightly different take on that to say that that it is also, in a sense, a reaction against what had become the state religion, right? Which
True.
was,
Yeah, for
full
sure.
the dogma of the Communist Party, of Stalin, et cetera,
Right.
right? So
Absolutely.
this new post-war generation of Soviet filmmakers, they're not just hearkening back to, the church without understanding all of the reactionary elements of it. Rather, they're almost rebelling against what is the state religion, that being the Communist Party.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that, for sure.
So anyway, all right, let's try to keep it under the 2 hour mark. So you got like 6 minutes, 6 minutes,
Well, that's
Shalon. Let's do it.
That's perfect. I have one last film, and I it's hard to talk about in words anyway, so we can keep it short. But and it does go to religion as well. So the last film is by Sergei Parajanov, which is a 1969 film called The Color of Pomegranates. This is a combination Soviet Armenian film. So this film is essentially about the 18th century Persian poet, Sayat Nova. And he's also known as the King of Songs. And even though this person doesn't necessarily play a role in Soviet history, for instance, he was a figure that they would have heard about at this time. So his poems, essentially, in this movie, again, it's not really plot based, it's 100% a visual movie. um, Essentially what they did was they put his poems in a visual sense. You see his poems rather than hear them. So all of the different scenes they're broken up into chapters, very similar to Andrei Rublev, his childhood, and then when he's a prince, and old age, and so forth. And you actually see these like sort of folk melodies, and sheep and fruit and animals and all these things that are images from his actual poetry that they put in a visual setting. But another thing that's really interesting about this movie is that the visuals are presented in a very sort of two-dimensional kind of way, very much like an icon painting. So again, it goes back to this thing that after the thaw, we see all these references to the Russian church, and this entire movie is almost as if they've like recreated real life icon paintings to illustrate this poet's life. So again, it's a very visual sort of thing. You might have noticed, from those of us who remember the days of MTV, which might not be many of us, the things like Madonna's videos, REM's music video, "Losing My Religion," they're actually some of them reference this movie, so they might have actually seen some imagery from this movie before, without realizing it. So anyway, that's all I'll mention about that, since we're running low on time.
Did you
But
ever see Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors?
no.
I believe that's the title of it. I think I'd have to unpack my old boxes of DVDs, but Parajanov had another film called Shadows of the Forgotten Ancestors that was very similar, but it was also like visual poetry, very similar to it. Not as good as Color of Pomegranates, not as well respected, but another one that's worth seeing.
I'll have to check that one out.
Okay, Shalon, what do you think? What recommendations are you going to give that didn't make the list? Give I don't know, give one or two.
All right. Well, if I had to give a recommendation that didn't make the list we talked about today, I'll give two. How's that? I'll say Eisenstein's 1930 film Que Viva Mexico. And then I'll also, well, I'll say three. I'll cheat and say three. I'll say a 1975 Soviet Japanese film called Dersu Usala. Uzala, sorry. And then I'll also say another Tarkovsky film, which is his 1983 film Nostalgia. I know a lot of people are familiar with Solaris and Stalker, which are also wonderful films. But Nostalgia is one that I particularly love, and also deals with many of the same themes that we talked about.
Shalon van Tine has been my guest today. Shalon is a wonderful person, but she is also an author, a cultural historian. Her website, shalonvantine.com, SHALONVANTINE.com. She is a regular contributor with CounterPunch, and I hope you will follow her and support her work. Shalon, thanks for chatting about movies with us. I guess we'll figure out what the next country we'll do is.
I already have some ideas, but we'll
Oh my
figure it out.
god. Oh my god. All right. We'll leave the nerd stuff till I hang up the recording. Okay,
Okay.
listeners, thank you as always, and we will chat again next week.